So this is a Venn diagram that many of you may have seen me put out there in social media, as well as related to some of the work that I have done around adult children of refugees and immigrants. And so what we have here along the left-hand side and the right-hand side are the structural aspects that give rise to the phenomenon of trauma. And what happens is we micro the macro. We hyper-focus on the individual and we lose a sense of the landscape within which we arise. And so we have to name the forces of imperialism, colonialism, land theft, enslavement, war, genocide, and patriarchy, as well as the ideologies of extractivism, sexism, classism, ableism, and heterosexism. Traditional psychology says that, what's wrong with you? Traditional psychology says what's wrong with you. Trauma-informed psychology says what happened to you. Culturally informed psychology says what happened to your people. And liberation psychology says, and what continues to happen to you and to your people. And so we have to recognize this landscape of trauma includes historical, ideological, present, pervasive, systemic, intergenerational, interpersonal, institutional, and internalized trauma and concepts about self, concepts about identity, concepts about race that we have internalized, about gender, about sexual identity, gender identity, class. And it's this distorted self-perception that I believe is the hallmark of trauma. And so we know from all the research around individual trauma, complex developmental trauma, it's a distorted self-concept. And collective trauma is collected trauma. Trauma that has bioaccumulated over time and has become erased or invisibilized or minimized. And that results in a distorted sense of cultural identity, however you define your people to be. And so for some of us, trauma isn't something in the past. It's something that continues and is alive in this present moment because of the identities that we inhabit within a larger landscape. And within this larger landscape, we have voluntary migration. Migrant workers, international students, parachute children are children who are sent abroad in order to get an education, in order to get a working visa, in order to get residency, in order to get citizenship, so that other family members may be able to be sponsored over, and also so that future generations have a toehold or a foothold somewhere else. Satellite babies is the phenomenon where I'll speak about it in terms of first-person experience. My cousin, who migrated from Vietnam to Australia, has children and went back to Vietnam and left the children there, or the infant there, with the grandparents, for the grandparents to raise, as is the custom in my people if we were actually all living together, but we're not because of the migration. And then grandparents raise my cousin's child and children until they're elementary school age. And then those children are sent to Australia to live with my sister. and be raised in Australia. And that comes with its own set of particular circumstances and conditions and emotional disruption. And then immigrants. And here I want to pause on the word immigrant, because when you are white-bodied, you're an expat. When you're a black or a brown body, you're an immigrant. And I'm a part of Australians in the United States Facebook groups, and we're Australian expats, just like there are Canadian expats and British expats and French expats and German expats, Swiss expats. And yet when you're not, you're an immigrant. So we have Mexican immigrants, Chinese immigrants. Yeah. And so when you're an immigrant, there are aspects of acculturation, enculturation, assimilation, marginalization, and a racialized identity that can become struggles for the individual who's experienced voluntary migration. And that can also be quote unquote voluntary migration. And we'll unpack some of this in our time together today. There are also traumatized, stigmatized, and displaced peoples. So while this includes refugees, for whom Holocaust survivors are a subset, we also have Indigenous peoples, enslaved peoples, our queer youth, those who are fleeing family violence, those who are fleeing extreme religious circumstances. And then also I put into this category adoptees, in particular transracial, transnational adoptees. And so these aspects of collective trauma, individual trauma, forced displacement, and identity shame at the group level, as well as at the individual level, arises. And within this population here, I'm going to focus upon forced displacement as a phenomenon, knowing that it may or may not cause you to leave the arbitrary national borders that we have today. Being traumatically uprooted has its own experiencing of displacement that is pertinent and unique, depending on whether it's generation 1.0, generation 1.5, or generation 2.0. So generation 1.0 are people like my parents who left Vietnam as adults. Generation 1.5 are individuals like myself who were forced to leave Vietnam under the age of 18. Typically, generation 1.5 is considered to be those under the age of 12. And then we have generation 2.0, who are individuals who are born on a land that is not the land of their ancestors. And so within that distinction, we also have unique experiences based on where we are in our human development over the course of a lifespan. And I also think that there isn't much research or literature out there about people who are elderly when they are forced to flee. And I believe part of the reason behind that is because there were so few of them. I remember there only being one Vietnamese elder in amongst 24 refugee families. And yet there are unique challenges for those who've had to leave everything and everyone they've ever known while in their 50s, 60s, or 70s. There's also the experiencing of intergenerational trauma. So parents may be traumatized and or traumatizing, and there is a distinction between the two that causes for the impact upon the next generation to be slightly different, depending on whether your parents were traumatized or traumatizing. And within this subset, there's actually quite a lot of research. And so I feel ever so grateful in ways that I don't want to diminish the suffering and the struggle of adult children of alcoholics and others raised in family of origin dysfunction, adult children of Holocaust survivors, and adult children of veterans with PTSD. And this was actually where I began my me search, because there was so very little research or we search about us, by us, or for us 20 years ago when I was a young adult. And so this is the areas of adverse childhood experiences, abuse and or neglect, parent-child attachment issues, the inverted parent-child relationship, whereas children, we had to take on the roles of being a parent to our parents. There's impaired and delayed grief, because when you're living in survival, living hand to mouth, our parents had to keep moving forward because that's how we survived. And so the family conditions are one where there's impaired and delayed grief. When parents have PTSD, they engage in auto-hypnoid storytelling, meaning that my parents would tell me the same story over and over again as a way of trying to pass on stories to me. And yet I kept hearing the same story over and over and over again until I became numbed out to it. And yet whenever I asked questions, there was a narrative silence. I couldn't get any more information out of them. And so there was a paradoxical space where it wasn't okay to learn more. And at the same time, I became vicariously traumatized to my parents' stories. Being raised by folks who experienced survivor guilt meant that I also experienced vicarious survivor guilt. My parents were unable to enjoy their lives, knowing that they'd left family members behind in Vietnam. And so they showed their love through work and service and bringing over family members or sending money back home. And so what that meant for me in terms of vicarious survivor guilt is I didn't know that it was okay to enjoy myself or enjoy my life. And so the struggles that I have around that actually become normalized within this larger landscape. And then the adultified child phenomenon is one where as a child, I took on the roles and responsibilities of an adult, and as an adult, whenever something incredibly stressful happens, I regress or revert to child responses because there wasn't anyone who was there for me developmentally through my preteens and teens to teach me adaptive ways in which to deal with stress and life stresses and with my emotions. And so there's a common package of survival strategies for adultified children: denial, control, perfectionism, all or nothing thinking, a harsh inner critic. And yet these are all adaptive strategies in lieu of having parents, role models, mentors, or a village who could be there, not just for myself, but also for my family system as a child. And so the confluence of lived experiences and struggles may include issues around home and belonging, culture and identity. Who am I? Who do I come from? Where do I come from? What is this life for? I mean, that's what culture is. It's a cosmology that helps me to place myself in amongst a larger world view. There may be struggles around PTSD and a survival orientation. The word PTSD suggests post-traumatic stress disorder. It's something in the past that's living on into the present. However, if we look at the work of Resma Medicum, as well as psychiatrist Dr. Colin A. Ross, PTSD causes us to develop a set of future-oriented survival strategies that live in the present moment that can be heightened and exacerbated when you hold an identity that is marginalized or racialized by society. Our imposter syndrome is actually our survival strategy. We needed to become someone else in the moment or out there in the world, and then be someone else at home. Codependence, being whoever you need me to be in order for me to survive, is also a survival strategy. And I also frame codependence as the inability to grieve. When we don't know how to let go, we don't know how to set boundaries. Yeah. And I also frame codependence structurally at the micro level between two individuals. When someone has incredibly strong narcissistic tendencies, then the only way to be in relationship with that person is to have extremely strong codependent tendencies. And yet when we look at this structurally, in a society that offers a lack of resources, resourcing, escape routes, education, advocacy for AFAB folks within the heteronormative relationship that denies any way to leave an abusive relationship, because the structures are set up to maintain male power structures, then the only way the lineage of women in my ancestry could have survived is to allow the men in their lives to be the center and the focus, because that's how we get ahead, is by how well we marry. That can then ensure resources then get passed on to the offspring. We may struggle with workaholism and addictions, and they can also be our superpowers to feel alive, to numb out, and to feel needed. A refugee is someone that nobody wants. And so finding ways in which to be needed can ensure being less unwanted in a landscape that doesn't want you. And this can also be a survival strategy within a family system that is stressed out, that is focused on survival, where parents may not have the bandwidth, or perhaps culturally may not have the capacity or understanding around taking delight in children. And so children, we know it's our birthright to be delighted in. And if we're not delighted in, we surrogate, we substitute with being needed. Because being needed means that I'm accepted. I might get validation for it. I'm not minimized or overlooked. And that becomes a setup then for codependence in the traditional sense of the word, and also becomes a setup for compassion fatigue and for worker burnout. Because my wait list makes me feel that I'm wanted and needed. But it's a surrogate and a substitute for feelings that, or for experiences that I didn't get from my parents back then. And yet how adaptive as a survival strategy. I also believe that systemically and structurally we need to change the word worker burnout, because once again, that's a hyper focus on the individual. And we should change the word to exploitation. Because there are institutions and systems that exploit those of us who take pleasure in being wanted and being needed and wanting to serve. We may also have struggles around toxic shame, voicelessness, and rage. And it's not okay for me to be angry at my parents or to be an ungrateful refugee, an ungrateful immigrant. Yeah. And there may be struggles around abandonment. And there are layers to this. It's the abandonment of my physical dependency needs and emotional dependency needs as a child, as an adolescent, as an adult. There may be issues of abandonment around, for example, the withdrawal of US military assistance. So the abandonment may be experienced on a systemic or structural level. And these issues can contribute as well as confluence with, as well as be exacerbated by feelings of traumatic homesickness, traumatic grief, complex and ambiguous grief, and psychological homelessness. So traumatic homesickness is something that my mother experienced, where the whiff of the sniff of talk about home would cause for her nervous system and her body to have a trauma response. And she would go into dissociate, collapse, withdraw, become invisible. And yet I also see this phenomenon as going into a fight response or a flight response, or the nervous system activation becoming so strong that, similar to other expressions of trauma, there's a turning towards substances to dampen the activation in the nervous system, and or there may be the lateralizing of violence, like the charge of the activation in the nervous system needs to be discharged somehow. And that then becomes domestic violence, child abuse, moments of rage that can be hidden within our communities because we don't have words or a context within which to frame the phenomenon of anger, rage, addiction, or dissociate, collapse within a larger context. In a similar way, the whiff of the sniff of grief can cause for someone to have a trauma response. There are layers of complex and ambiguous grief. We often think of trauma as something that happened that shouldn't have happened, and yet trauma is also what didn't happen that should have happened. And in a similar way, grief is often framed as I had something and now it's gone. However, I posit that grief is also the not experiencing of something, and the not experiencing of something has left a pervasive emptiness on my inner landscape, and I can't name it other than through the weightiness of the emptiness. And then psychological homelessness is a term that I learned from Dr. Kenneth Hardy, who's a Black psychologist who works with people of colour. And it's a sense of betwixt and between, not belonging anywhere. Not being Australian enough, not being Vietnamese enough. Yeah. Not being enough for my parents and at the same time being too much for them. And then getting messages about this from my Vietnamese diaspora community. And yet within this same conversation about this topic, I also want to name that racism is not about not belonging or not fitting in. Racism is about dignity. I'll say that again because I know that that can be big for some of us. Racism is not about not belonging or not fitting in. Racism is about dignity. And I've had conversations with well-meaning white-bodied folks over the last 20 years who are trying to give me the messaging that they know what it's like to not belong or not fit in. And that always shuts down the conversation. And I never had the words for it until now. Because as well-meaning as they are, they've missed the point. They've missed the mark. And if we can distinguish between psychological homelessness and pervasive assaults on our fundamental sense of dignity, I believe we can make some traction in regards to healing.